holiday because we're celebrating freedom. In fact, one of the most common traditions that we do at the Pesach Seder is we have a pillow, or many people have a pillow at on the left side of the armrest, and when we drink the wine, eat the matzah, we lean to the left to show that we're in a state of freedom and we're not in a state of slavery. In other words, the setting, the ambiance of the Seder is supposed to be in a state of freedom. We're celebrating the fact that we're free people. Now, if you look at the content of the Seder, some of the foods that we eat, some of the practices that we do, some of the words that we say, not a lot of it is actually freedom inspiring. A lot of it is focused on the pain and negativity. Such as, I think, Marvin, you mentioned the horseradish before. We all know that we eat the maror, which is the bitter herbs. We dip the karpas in salt water, which there's many reasons for that, but one of the reasons is the tears, and so on. And there's many comments in the Haggadah about the slavery and what we went through, and reminiscing over the negative experiences that some might say we should just sort of try to forget about it versus trying to recreate it or imagine it, or re-experience it, God forbid, if it's done, it's over, we're free, let's move on, right? Why are we bringing up the past in such experiential ways to the point that we want the children to know about it if it's so painful and so hard? One of the things that we do, it's on the Seder plate, is called the Charoses. And the Charoses is a bit of an oxymoron. It's a contradiction. Here you have the text on the screen that explains it, but I'll just verbally elaborate. So the Charoses, the ingredients of the Charoses is usually apples and pears, and if there's no allergies, nuts, and then we add some wine as well. The Charoses is meant to represent the bricks and mortars that the Israelites had to make themselves, as part of the punishment, labor, as far as the torture that the Egyptians imposed upon the Israelites, that they would have to make it themselves. In fact, we'll see in a medrash soon that, and this is, sorry for being graphic, but they would actually take children, the newborn babies of the Israelites, and grind them into dust for the mortars. So the charoses that we make is sort of meant to look or represent the bricks and mortars that the Israelites had to make, and the pain and suffering that went along with it. Now, one thing that, and this goes on the Seder plate. This is one of the pieces on the Seder plate. One of the items on the Seder plate. Now, those of you who have tasted charoses know that it's pretty good. It's apples, pears, wine, and nuts. What could go wrong? In fact, usually the leftover charoses is saved for snacking on after the Seder, if we could. Why? Now, what do we use the charoses for in the practicality of the Seder? We dip the mar into the charoses before we make the blessing on the mar. And as we're going to see, there's a tradition where you actually dip the matzah in the charoses as well. So here you have something that's meant to represent, I guess in some traditions you put raisins in, but we don't in Chabad. But once again, all traditions are good. There's so many Passover traditions. In fact, we're going to show a bit of a dispute in this class about a Passover tradition that both come from original legitimate sources. But the point is, if the charoses is meant to represent the bricks and mortars, why are they sweet? Why are the ingredients sweet? If it's meant to represent suffering. We all know that the mar is bitter. We all know that the purpose of the mar is to bring about the bitterness of the slavery. No one disputes that. And even though a little bit of horseradish, is offers good flavor, we all know that in the bite size that we have to have at the Seder, it's definitely not pleasant. So why is the charoses done in this way? So we're going to start breaking apart this tradition of charoses, and we're going to use this Passover tradition to understand a very crucial survival tip from this practice at the Passover Seder. So Rabbi Amram says, and this is written by the Tur. The Tur was a man he was the child or the son of the Rosh. The Rosh, was Rabbeinu Asher, was a student of the Maharam of Rottenburg from Germany. And the Rosh lived in France, and he was one of the greatest Torah scholars of his time, greatest Jewish leaders of his time. And his son, Rabbi Yaakov, lived in Spain, actually, and he was very, very poor. But the Tur, the Rosh's son, the Tur, wrote a book. The reason why it's called the Tur is because he wrote a book called Arba Turim, which is the 4 pillars. And that book became the basis of the Code of Jewish Law. So he writes like this. Rabbi Amram wrote, one should recite the Hamotzi blessing on the Matzah, and then dip the Matzah in the Charoses and eat. And he's quoting Maimonides, the Rambam, who mentions this rule. But Rabbi Amram says, I don't understand the reasoning for the dipping. Rabbi Avraham, the son of Nasan, who was known as the Ravid, who authored the Manig, asks if Matzah represents liberation and Charoses represents the mortar, how can they be combined? So what you have here is a halachic dispute about a Passover tradition. Let me explain something here that's very important also about Jewish law and about biblical law, rabbinical law, and tradition. I'm not going to explain it all in detail, but just to give a basic understanding. There's the biblical law that's to eat matzah on the night of Pesach. That is a biblical commandment to eat matzah. So you have 2 biblical commandments on the night of Pesach, which is to eat matzah and to tell the story of Passover. Those are 2 biblical commandments. That doesn't mean that's all you should do. It doesn't mean that's the check boxes. The rabbinical commandments, sorry? No. So the rabbinical commandments, which is given to us in its most elaborate state of how it really should be done, is the Seder. The Seder, which translates as an order, which basically here's the best way to fulfill the commandments of telling the story of Passover through all the things that we have to do. When it comes to all the different traditions, on Pesach, it's all very important for many reasons, which we can talk about at a different time. And I think we have talked about why every tradition and every custom is very important. But the arguments or the debates are all holy, and they're all from legitimate sources. It's just that each one has legitimacy in a different form because of the reasoning and the situation that they found themselves in at the time, and as we're going to see in this exact case. So the Rambam writes that when you make the blessing Hamotzi on the matzah, which is after the Magid, usually we're starving at that point because the Magid takes a long time in the Seder. We wash, rachza, and then we are making the blessing on the matzah, and eat the matzah, and the Rambam says that the tradition is to dip the matzah in charoses, not the mar, but the matzah first. Then the mar also goes in the charoses. And there are those that challenge the Rambam, saying, I don't see where you do that, why you do that, because the matzah represents the liberation, the freedom, and charoses represents the slavery. Why are we dipping the freedom, the liberation, into slavery? You can't combine those two. A good example of that was someone was saying, it's like drinking British tea on July 4th. If that makes any sense. Anyways. So perfect. We'll put it this way. Matzah, everyone agrees, represents the liberation of Egypt. It's the bread of freedom. It's the bread that we walked out with. It's the bread of faith, bread of healing. And we all know that. The Charoses represents the bricks and mortar, which represents the suffering, as does the mar. Now, I know that there's the korach, the sandwich, but that's a different thing because that was a tradition in the Beis Hamikdash, and we're going to get to that later, or we'll explain that later. But right now, the matzah cannot mix with the mar or the charoses because the matzah is freedom, and the mar and the charoses both represent the suffering. So you can't mix the two, according to the second opinion. It was known as Rabbi Avraham. The Rambam, on the other hand, says, no, you should mix the two. You should mix the matzah and the charoses. So let's go to the core of why we do everything we do at the Seder. Let's go to the core of why we do what we do. So the mar, why do we eat the mar? Why do we eat the bitter herbs? Because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our ancestors in Egypt. That's the simple explanation, that in order to experience to some extent or to commemorate the suffering of our ancestors, we eat the bitter herbs. Rashi explains what was the suffering, okay? Because we all know that suffering and pain is something that every human being experiences on some level. I don't think you could find a human being anywhere that will say they never suffered at all or pain. So what is the suffering that we're talking about? So Rashi quotes, Moshe famously complained to Hashem and said, well, so what, look at the suffering that we're talking about. We're not just talking about random suffering. Moshe famously complained to Hashem, why have you harmed this nation? And our sages explain, what was Moshe talking about? Why would Moshe say this to Hashem? So explains the Agadah, this was a reference to the mortar, which is represented by the Charoses. What does that mean? For when the Jewish people ran short of mortar to make bricks, the Egyptians ground Jewish babies into powder and used them as filler for the mortar. That is suffering. And it was this suffering that the Charoses represents. So Rabbi Avram says, how could you dip matzah, which represents the freedom of slavery, into Charoses, which represents this kind of suffering? And how do they go together? Okay. Now, why do we eat matzah? Because our ancestors had no time to let their dough rise before the King of all kings, the Holy One, blessed be, revealed himself to them and redeemed them. So basically, matzah is redemption. Even though matzah may not taste as great as we want it to taste, but the point is, matzah is the bread of freedom. It's the bread of selflessness. It's egoless, and it's true freedom spiritually and physically, and it represents the exodus from Egypt, and that's why we eat the matzah. So why would we dip it in the charoses? So now you have the Rambam who says, no, mix them together. The Rambam was a serious man. He knew what he was talking about. He was obviously quoting a legitimate source. But Rabbi Avram says, how could you mix the two together? So we have a halachic dispute. How do we combine the two? How do we reconcile the two? How do we make this make sense? So Avram said, this is nonsense. Once again, Maimonides failed to identify a reason for his ruling. The truth is that over the last few centuries, many of our teachers of blessed memory believe that the matzah over which we recite Hamotzi blessing should not be dipped in charosas, and this is the prevailing custom. This is from the Ashkenazi side, that basically you do not dip the matzah in charosas. So most Ashkenazim don't dip the matzah in charosas. Many Sephardic Jews do dip the matzah in charosas because they follow similar commentaries like the Rambam. Now in Chabad, we don't dip the matzah in charosas, but only because we don't dip matzah in any liquid, period, for the first 7 days of Passover, which is a different conversation. So now, how do we reconcile these two opinions? But more importantly, what is this lesson of charosas? What are we trying to represent? And back to our original question, why are we recreating this suffering? Once again, the night of Pesach, the Seder, a lot of what we do is about the children, about trying to generate the curiosity of the children to ask questions, not just the 4 questions, but wanting to know, why are we doing this? Why is the Seder happening? Why is this? Why are we reading this? And why are we all drinking 4 cups of wine? Why are we dipping vegetables into salt water? We're doing things specifically to ignite the curiosity of the children. But why does it all have to be about the bitterness? I mean, not all, but like, why is there so much about the bitterness and so much about the pain? There was a time, post-Holocaust, there was obviously a lot of support and a lot of support groups and a lot of support needed for Holocaust survivors for obvious reasons. But there was also a desperate need. There was starting to become a desperate need in the 70s or whenever it was, maybe even in the 60s, of support groups for children of Holocaust survivors. Why? Because their parents, who are survivors themselves, were putting their children through so much pain of trying to communicate how bad it was, because they wanted their children to know how bad it was, so they would, for whatever reason, so they should never go through it again, or they should never take anything for granted, for whatever reasons it was. But the point is, children of Holocaust survivors were so traumatized by having to have their parents constantly like imbue the pain and suffering that they went through, that they themselves needed support groups. So the question is, why are we doing this at the Seder by like bringing the charosas and the mar and the karpas and all these different things that we represent the bitterness, if we're trying to celebrate freedom, we're leaning on the pillow, leaning to the left to celebrate our state of freedom. Let's be free and let's celebrate it. We're drinking 4 cups of wine. I mean, that should be the thing. That should be the main thing. Let's cut out the negativity. So we're going to use this dispute between Rabbi Avram and Maimonides to understand something so important and crucial. So let us, I'm going to leave it on this slide here. This is actually going to help us here. Let us understand something about pain, suffering, and bitterness, or whatever we're going to frame this. Remember, the charoses specifically, the bricks and mortars, unlike the mar, which doesn't taste great, mar, which is the horseradish that we eat, the bitter herbs, charoses is sweet, tastes very good. In fact, it's a great snack if it's made right. Yet it represents the pain and suffering. Nobody argues that. Whether you dip the matzah in it or not is an argument, but nobody disputes that it represents the pain and suffering. What is the hidden message of making the charoses sweet? And this is why the charoses is a survival kit or survival tip for life, for being Jewish, for everything that our ancestors are hinting to us in the Passover Seder. And we're going to elaborate on it more as we go further, but here's the key. Everything we go through in life, it's not just that we could channel the energy or use the positive silver lining for whatever we can to become more, to have a better perspective on life and harness it for doing good and channel the anger, channel the pain into something. That's not what we're talking about. Everything in life, specifically challenges in life, have an opportunity to to bring us to something that allows us to see within the pain itself a power that is beyond belief or beyond recognition that wouldn't be seen without that pain. And this, I'm walking on shaky, what's the term here? I'm walking on shaky ground because what I'm going to say here is a little bit controversial. But there's certain things we learn about ourselves and our capabilities and about who we are through the challenges that we face. Things that we would never know if we didn't go through those challenges. So once again, we're not talking about harnessing the energy of a past event into good. That's not what we're talking about. When we go through something that pushes us to our limit, okay, and for the sake of the conversation, we're going to talk about a regular life challenge, a business challenge, a relationship challenge. We're not talking about a disaster challenge for now. We all know that those challenges that push us to our limits, happy ending or not, it pulls something out of us that we did not know we had it before. And we become something almost different because of it. What we do with it after is a whole other question, because we have to decide if we're going to, that newfound power that we have, that newfound abilities, that newfound strength that we found, we have to still make the choice to use it. That's a different stage of life. But we discover it when we face this challenge. Not only that, the tougher the experience or the more painful the experience could actually bring out something within us that allows us to harness something that wasn't even inside of us. And let me explain. There are certain capabilities that we actually have already, it's just that we don't tap into it because it's just deep down and we need someone to push us. So for example, let's say it's an obstacle course, boot camp, right? So you go to boot camp and someone goes to boot camp, right? So they push you to your limit. I think the I was watching a documentary about it, and the instructor was saying, I'm not going to ask you to do anything impossible, but I will make your life miserable. In other words, I will, ask you to do things that are extremely difficult, but I'm not going to ask you to do anything impossible. In other words, I'm going to push you to your limit, and I'm going to draw out strength that you actually have, but you're going to have to work really hard to pull it out. That's one level. That's the challenge of life throwing curveballs at you. Relationships, business, tough challenges. Go even further, use your imagination. But then there are challenges that are so bad and so difficult and so painful that it brings out a element that actually did not exist within us. An element of our soul that hovers above us because it's so godly that it cannot actually manifest inside of us. It's not even part of us. It's the two parts of the soul that are so literal parts of God that if they are inside of us, they would not be able to be contained within our existence. And the only way for us to overcome the pain that we are going through is through tapping into those two levels of our soul, specifically the highest level of the soul, which is called the Yechida, the quintessential, the essence. The Pintelayid sometimes is called in Yiddish, or the spark of God that can never be extinguished. Now, even though we say that's inside of us, it's really not, because on a day-to-day basis, we don't feel it. It hovers above us. When somebody goes through a situation like the Holocaust, or like any other, or like slavery in Egypt, or like pick your poison, like on October 7th, for the people that went, or like being a hostage in Gaza, like pick your poison. It brings out a level of strength that can only be explained as a God gift of that part of the soul coming into the person and bringing that level of power and strength into the person that the person actually didn't have, but now they do. Why is this important? Because when it comes to a situation like slavery in Egypt, there is a sweetness that we have to recognize. There is the mortar. We do have the bitter herbs, and we do eat it, and some people cry from just the bad taste, or people get all red in the face. And there is the regular pain. But then there's a level of pain that is still as painful as it gets, but there is a sweetness to it too. Because there's a sweetness of recognizing that this pain actually brought about the greatest revelation that did not exist beforehand. And we're going to explain what that means. And that's what this contrast idea. So let's read this thing over here. We're just going to explain the contrast, and then we're going to break it down into the situation. Good photographic lighting entails more than understanding how light works. It also requires an understanding of the emotion that lighting scenarios portray. How the lighting sculpts forms or informs the emotional element of an image helps drive a photograph's narrative. The light becomes more than a way to illuminate a scene. It becomes the determining factor of the image and how the viewer perceives the people or objects in it. So I guess the idea of the way the light is projected and the way the light is developing the film, or the light is shining in the right direction of the camera or whatever it is, that light is just as relevant, if not more relevant, than what you're actually filming or what you're actually trying to capture, because that will allow the viewer to experience what you're experiencing as the person who's there at the moment. Why is that important? Why is that relevant? Because the pain and suffering of Egypt brought about a sweetness, doesn't minimize the pain, but it brought about a contrast, a sweetness of revelation that would be impossible to reveal without it. In other words, the world would not be able to sustain this revelation of godliness without that level of pain. In fact, when Hashem promised Abraham that your children will inherit this land, they will get the Torah and inherit this land, God had to preface that they're first going to have to be slaves in a land that's not theirs. In other words, the only way for this revelation to exist, for this revelation to be contained, in other words, for the world to be a vessel to receive it, for the people to be a vessel to be ambassadors of it, they have to first go through this type of pain. In other words, it's that pain that brings about the sweetness that allows us to be vessels and receivers and to be ones that could appreciate what is being revealed here. Now, how does this play out to the Rambam and Rabbi Avram? We're going to explain that, and then we're going to explain better what the Charoses really represents, because I know that I've been a little abstract here, but I'm going to bring it down to reality in a minute. So the Rambam says, we begin by declaring that we were slaves to Paro in Egypt and describing all the suffering he imposed on us. And then, that's just the beginning of Makot. But then we conclude with the miracles and wonders performed for us and with our liberation. And that's the most important part. So we have to talk about the past of the slavery, but then we have to focus on the redemption. That's the Rambam. And what does the Haggadah say? That in every generation we have to see ourselves as if we came out of Egypt, but God liberated us in every generation from Egypt as if he did not just to our ancestors, but to us as well. So I'm skipping that because I want to go to something else here. So what is the purpose, according to the Rambam, of dipping the matzah in Charoses? Is to remember that God liberated us from the slavery and symbolized by the Charoses and granted us freedom as symbolized by the matzah. In other words, what the Rambam is, I'm going to go deeper into what's being said over here. What the Rambam is trying to say is that what makes the Charoses sweet, what it allows the Charoses, which represents the bitterness of the mortars, which as the Medrash tells us was the powder of babies, what allows that to be sweet? In other words, not the Charoses. The Charoses is apples and pears and wine. But the mortars in the time of slavery, unfortunately, was one of the most horrific things the Egyptians did to the Jewish people. So what allows the Charoses dish to have the sweetness in it? It's by dipping the matzah, the freedom. When you dip the matzah, the freedom, into it, you're actually able to transform and recognize the sweetness that was revealed through it. And the Rambam is coming from a much higher place of being able to transform and being able to take a most difficult situation ever and transform it into freedom, into matzah. And that's why the Rambam is it's not sufficient to dip the mortar, the bitter herbs, into the Charoses, which is what we do anyways. For the Rambam, that's not enough, because you're just dipping bitterness into bitterness, even though the Charoses is sweet. But they both represent the bitterness. The Rambam wants us to dip the matzah into the Charoses because we have to transform the pain and suffering into freedom. And we have to see that it was the liberation of God. It was the liberation that God took us out and revealed himself that allowed us to see the sweetness of the pain and allowed us to see the revelation that was coming down from it. That's the Rambam. So now, I'm going to get back to this one. I'm going to get back to the slide in a sec, because I want to first... Now, what is Rabbi Avram's opinion? Rabbi Avram's opinion, before we read the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Avram's opinion is no, we have to live in reality. In reality, we're still enslaved. We're still not free. We're living in exile. Don't forget, the Rambam lived in horrific conditions in Egypt. He lived in Egypt, the Rambam. First, he lived in Spain, but then his family had to flee from the Muslim conquerors who were killing anyone who didn't convert. They had to go to North Africa. Then eventually they went to Egypt, where he became the physician of the Sultan, and his life was miserable there. So the Rambam wasn't free, and neither was Rabbi Avram. They were living in horrible times. But the Rambam was able to transcend the reality to say that we have to see the matzah and let the matzah transform the mortar into sweetness. But Rabbi Avram was saying, no, we have to live in reality. In reality, you cannot ignore the pain and suffering. You can't just call it sweet. It's real pain. People are suffering. The redemption has not arrived yet. The third temple has not been built. People are in pain. Don't dip the matzah yet. We have to eat the matzah because it's a commandment, and we have to celebrate the freedom that we're in right now compared to what we were in Egypt, but we're still not completely free. So we ain't dipping no matzah into Charoses yet. Not until Hashem brings the final redemption. Because in reality, we're still suffering. So there's legitimacy to both opinions, because the Rav Avram wants the reality to still persist and not to give up on recognizing the pain of other people, but the Rambam wants us to stand above it. Now let's go back to that slide. So for the Rambam, he's not afraid to invoke the trauma of saying, we're going to dip the matzah into this charoses, which represents the pain and suffering. He's not worried because the pain and suffering to him is the sweetness that's revealed through the revelation of godliness and the revelation of the matzah and the freedom. So the Rambam stands above it all. But Rabbi Avram says no, because while we are in exile, we feel pain more than freedom. So charoses is just reinforcing sadness instead of highlighting the joy, and therefore we eat the matzah alone without the charoses. The charoses just remains as still a memory of the pain and suffering. And yes, it's sweet, but it's not a partner of the matzah just yet. It will fully be sweet and fully be realized when Mashiach comes. Now comes the Maharal of Prague. And the Maharal of Prague, who lived a couple hundred years after both of these Torah giants, the Maimonides and Rabbi Avraham, and he sort of aligns the two of them. And he says like this: when the Jewish people exit, and don't forget, the Maharal of Prague lived in a time
You okay? Everyone all right?
Maybe his screen froze.
Apparently. Could be sunspots. Ha ha ha. I hope that's all it is.
I am so sorry, guys.
You okay?
Yeah, my computer shut
Okay.
off. I am so sorry about that.
No, that's okay. There's sunspots today happening, and I thought, okay, I hope that's it. I hope everything's okay.
No, it could be, I mean, I'm not sure what it was, but I think it was just my computer shut off for a second. Let me get the PowerPoint back up and we will just continue where we left off. Okay. Right. So the Maharal of Prague lived in a time during the blood libels when they said that we use matzah, we use blood in our matzah. So he lived in a very tough time too. But he wrote, here 1 second, let me get the right slide. Oh, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. I keep on going. I'm sorry. Here it is. So he wrote like this: when the Israelites exited Egypt, they became recipients of intrinsic godliness and therefore remained forever free. Jewish people are inherently free because they are intrinsically holy. So this was a gift that God gave us during the Exodus. Circumstantial factors cannot undo inherent truths. Even when Jewish people are under circumstantial subjugation, they are inherently free. So what the Maharal of Prague is saying like this, is that even when we're in the worst of situations, what we were gifted with the Exodus from Egypt is an element within our soul that allows us to transcend, the pain and suffering. There's a story of the Belzer Rebbe who was in Auschwitz, and he managed to sneak his tefillin into the camps. And while he was wearing, but he wasn't allowed to wear them. I mean, he had to wear them in secret, and he had to hide them. So when he was caught wearing tefillin once by one of the Nazi guards, so the Nazi guard started to beat him up with his stick, and as the Belzer Rebbe falls on the ground, the Nazi guard stands on his head and pushes his head into the ground, into the mud. And as he's pushing his head into the mud, the Nazi guard screams at him and says, "Do you still believe you're the chosen people?" And the Belzer Rebbe, like when he was able to pick his head up, says, "I've never been more sure in my life." So here you have a man who's in this worst possible situation, but through his ability to transcend the moment, he was able to have the confidence to let his soul shine through and not allow the physical pain or the physical situation and the physical confinement limit his ability to rise above the difficulties that he was in. This is the Maharal of Prague's way of reconciling the Rambam and Rabbi Avram, because according to this, the Rambam simply was saying we have to transcend the moment, even though we're suffering. Let's transcend and let's dip the matzah in the charoses. And Rabbi Avram was saying we can't do that. We have to recognize that there's pain too. So yes, we're having a Seder. No one's suggesting that we don't celebrate freedom and that we don't celebrate the miracles, of course. But at the same time, we're still under the reign of those who want to kill us, and we have to recognize that. And therefore, let's not overdo it by dipping the matzah in charoses. So according to this, the Maharal of Prague kind of explains the background of how the two opinions are based on. Now, the previous Rebbe, when he was imprisoned by the Soviet communists, and they tortured him, they sentenced him to death, and when they told him that, they're going to kill him, and, most people are petrified when they hear that, he said, those people must have one world and two gods. But if you have one God and two worlds, I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of that. And here's what he writes. Every nation on earth must know that only our bodies were subjugated to exile and the control of other countries. Our souls, however, were never driven into exile and never subjected to the power of others. We must declare openly for all to know that concerning our religion, Torah, mitzvahs, and Jewish customs, we have no overlords. No method of compulsion can be effective against us. We must declare with our powerful, intense Jewish I'm not sure what that is, but it basically means the perseverance and strength, backed by the thousands of years of Jewish self-sacrifice. Touch not my anointed one, and persecute not my prophets. That Hashem stands with us and protects our soul, and our souls are never in exile. May Hashem grant us the courage not to be swayed by the bodily torture they inflict upon us. On the contrary, may we accept it with joy. Every punishment we receive, God forbid, for the sustaining of Jewish schools, this is while he was running an underground network in the Soviet Russia, which was punishable by death, immediate death. If you were caught teaching Torah to children, or if you were caught doing anything religious, you were sentenced to death immediately. Studying the Torah and observing the mitzvahs must fortify our courage in the sacred work of bolstering Judaism in the Soviet Union. We must remember that imprisonment and hard labor are transient, but the Torah and mitzvos are eternal. So this is something that we were gifted on the night of Pesach, and that we still have. Even no matter what happens around us, and no matter what situation we're in, or what pain and suffering we're in, our neshama, our souls are always free. So even though the Mara represents our physical slavery, which is bitter and painful, and the physical pain is real pain, but the Charoses represents the spiritual slavery, and therefore the spiritual slavery can actually be sweet. Because the spiritual slavery is what allows us to see the revelation of godliness and allows us to see that we can still persevere and transcend the difficulties that we're faced with and survive it regardless of what they throw at us. And that's a powerful sweetness, because even though it's painful, and it is painful, but we're able to see the unique power that Hashem imbues with each and every one of us. Now, the Rambam goes on. This is the Maral. The hard labor they imposed on us was bitter, but it was not entirely unbearable. The mortar was a breaking point. Nothing was harsher than the mortar episode. And this is why we place a symbol of the mortar on our Seder table, because this was the worst of the worst of the worst. And it was this that brought about not just the redemption, but it brought about the ability to see the revelation of the redemption. And that even though they literally did the unthinkable, we still survived them. We still outdid them. We still managed to overcome them and become a nation from them, thanks to God's redeeming us, but we were able to outlive them. So the Rambam says, by dipping the matzah into Charoses, we affirm that even if we're not fully free, we're free in essence. And our neshama, our soul, is always free. And that is why we celebrate on the Seder night. But Rabbi Avram says if we're not fully free, highlighting partial freedom can backfire and cause the Jewish people to focus on what we're lacking. So therefore, let's focus on the reality and just eat the matzah, because that's what we're commanded to do. I know I added some words there, but that's the idea. Now the Rebbe is going to bring us home, and the Rebbe is going to say something very powerful, and this is how we turn this into a survival kit. So based on the above, we can explain the dispute between Maimonides and Rabbi Avram about dipping matzah into Charoses and the distinction between the era of the temple and the era of exile. When the temple stood, it is possible to entirely fulfill the commandment to remember being enslaved in Egypt and going free, because we were still free during the times of the temple. We could remember that you were enslaved as if it were ourselves enslaved, and then granted our freedom, and now we are free because we're living in the times of the temple. Therefore, during those times, all agreed that it was appropriate to dip the matzah in Charoses to demonstrate that Hashem took us from slavery to freedom. That's during the time of the Holy Temple, at least during the free times during the Holy Temple. However, today, now that we are in exile, we can't fulfill its entirety of the commandment to remember that you were enslaved and liberated, because we are no longer free, and we don't have the freedom to have our own temple and to do what we need to do. Therefore, the question is whether it is possible to fulfill it in part. Can we still pretend that we're free? Can we celebrate being redeemed from the unique intrinsic subjugation of Egypt, because now they are not grinding babies into mortar, at least not whatever. Since we are still free intrinsic subjugation, despite being back to the circumstantial subjugation as explained above, can we still do that? And that's the dispute of the Rambam and Rabbi Avram. And what does the Rambam say? Maimonides believed it is possible to fulfill this commandment in part, and therefore rules that we dip the matzah into Charoses and celebrate that we were liberated from intrinsic mortar subjugation, symbolized by the Charoses, though we remain in circumstantial subjugation. Rabbi Avram disagreed and held that freedom can't be parsed, and we are either free or not. Accordingly, although we tell the story of the Exodus in detail, we nevertheless can't fulfill we can't fulfill in its entirety the commandment to remember you were enslaved and went free while we are back in circumstantial subjugation. So what the Rebbe is saying here, and even though it's interesting because the Rebbe doesn't end off with the like paskening like the Rambam, like saying we should follow the Rambam, because in Kabbalah we actually don't dip the matzah in Charoses. But there's an interesting piece that the Rebbe actually The Rebbe actually follows the Rambam to a T in terms of the lessons and what the Rambam's thought process is. So even though we may not practice it in reality, the Rebbe still fought for the Rambam's message that he was sending through, and that's what we're going to talk about. So here's a quote from the Code of Jewish Law that the first Kabbalah Rebbe codified. Charoses should be thick because it is a testament to the mortar by which our ancestors were subjugated. Then we must soften the consistency with liquid to remember the blood. It is appropriate to soften it with red liquid such as mead or red wine. It is appropriate to make the charoses of fruits that serve as metaphors to the Jewish people, such as figs, as written, the fig tree had put forth in its green figs, nuts, as it is written, I went down to the nut garden, dates, as it is written, let me climb up to the palm tree, pomegranates, as it is written, like a split pomegranate, apples, as it is written, under the apple tree I awoke you, where the Jewish woman gave birth without pain, and almonds, for God was diligent about ending our exile. In Chabad, we just use apples, pears, and nuts. I don't know why, to be honest, why we don't use all the other stuff. But anyways, the Rebbe was very clear that we follow the Rambam's message, even if we don't follow the tradition because of other concerns. We don't mix matzah with liquid because we're worried that matzah, there might be flour in the matzah that wasn't baked, and it might rise with coming in contact with liquid. However, the Rebbe's approach to the coming of Mashiach and the Rebbe's approach to the Rambam's message here was always one that when you practice something and you live a life that you want to live, almost like living a fantasy, even if it's a fantasy, but you live it because you know it's something God promised us, you actually speak it into reality. You live it into reality. In other words, if we know that Hashem promised that he's going to bring the redemption, and when he brings the redemption, everybody's going to be living to know God, and to the knowledge of God will spread in the world like the sea spreads across the seabed. So that Rebbe would say, practice now. Live like that now. Start learning Torah to know godliness like that now. In other words, start acting the way we know Mashiach is going to bring the level of godliness that's going to be revealed when Mashiach comes, or the peace, the world peace that's going to exist when Mashiach comes. Let's start pretending that already exists. So we start acting with goodness and kindness in that level, even though in reality it's not exactly the way it needs to be. But in actions that we do, we could already start practicing. Of course, okay, yeah, the world's not perfect, and the other people aren't going to be perfect, but we could still do something good. The Rebbe was always was a pragmatist, but he was also believed that through our actions, we can actually speak it and do it into existence. What the Rambam was teaching us here, and what the Rebbe was quoting the Rambam and saying, that by dipping the Matzah and Charoses, the message here is that even though in reality, yes, we are still in exile, and yes, we are not in a great place, and there is still pain and suffering, but there's an ability to recognize that there's something much greater coming from this pain that's going to be revealed when Mashiach comes, and let's recognize that's actually happening. Let's pretend that that's going to literally happen before the Seder happens this year. And if we live that kind of life and believe that it's literally going to happen, and it's in this moment, it could happen right now, Mashiach could come, we can actually bring it about into existence. And this is why the Rebbe would always encourage us to say we want Mashiach now, or always, add a prayer for Mashiach, and always pretend or live as if we know Mashiach is about to come. And by doing that, we could actually usher in his arrival. And this is why the Charoses is our survival tip. Is our survival, what was the right word? Survival gear. Because the Charoses reminds us that as painful as the world gets in reality, there's always the sweetness, and there's always the ability to take the matzah, which represents the essence of our soul that is free, and nobody could subjugate it, nobody could put it into prison. And we could sweeten the Charoses and recognize that it's sweet, and recognize that there's a much happier ending coming, that there's an ending that's going to transform all the pain and suffering into the happiest moments. Like it says, the worst days on the Jewish calendar are going to become the happiest days. And we have that ability to start seeing that and living that and appreciating that. and let Pesach, no better time than Pesach, to be the time of our final redemption. May it happen soon, and may it happen speedily. So I want to wish you all a happy and healthy Pesach. And we're not going to have class for the next 2 weeks because next Thursday night is Pesach, obviously, and the Thursday after that is the night that Pesach ends. I will be helping transform a kitchen. So the next 2 weeks there will be no class, but after that we'll be back to normal scheduling.
Thank you. You were talking about